programmes in which I'll be putting the claims of politicians on both sides of the debate to the test. Tonight I'm joined by one of the Labour Party's leading campaigners for Britain to remain in the EU, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Hilary Benn. Welcome to the programme.
Good evening, Andrew.
Let's start with a quote from your leader, Jeremy Corbyn. It comes from way back in 1992, but I'm using it because it turned out that he's a bit of a prophet. This is what he said in the Commons debate about the Maastricht Treaty. You remember that was the treaty that set Europe on the road to economic and monetary union. He said that it would take away from national parliaments the power to set economic policy, hand over to an unelected set of bankers who'll impose the economic policies of price stability, deflation, high unemployment throughout the European community. Jeremy Corbyn. That was 24 years ago. What bit did he get wrong?
Well, the Jeremy of today is campaigning for us to remain in the European Union because a lot of things have changed since the Maastricht Treaty was passed. We've had the biggest global crash since the 1930s. That's been very hard for families and affected people's incomes. But Jeremy's clear, we're clear, the Labour Party is campaigning the trade unions for us to remain in the European Union because what has membership given us, Andrew? Jobs, investment, growth. We are the most successful country in Europe for attracting foreign direct investment, protected workers' rights, which I hope we can talk about.
We will indeed.
It gives us security, influence in the world, and it's helped to secure peace. So those are all strong arguments why we're working to remain.
Answered the question of what he got wrong there, because it would seem to me that he got it wrong right. The core project of the European Union is the Eurozone. We're not in it, but it's the core project. It's become synonymous with economic stagnation, suffering, mass unemployment, especially for young folks. And I'm just puzzled, why does Labour want to be in a union run by people who are prepared to inflict such pain and misery on ordinary people?
Well, I think you answered the question in part when you reminded everyone we are not in the euro. Now, the last Labour government took that decision. It was a very wise choice to make at the time. It's even more wise in hindsight because we have an economy where unemployment is falling. There are a record number of people in work. And it is true that other European countries that are in the Eurozone, and it was their decision, are facing a tough time.
But it is the core project of the European Union.
But the global crash affected countries inside and outside the European Union. We understand that, but
no more so in the Western world than in the Eurozone. And we know how bad it's been. And I'm just puzzled why you want to be allies with people in a union, an institution that wishes to and has been prepared to inflict such pain.
Because it has given us jobs, investment and growth. And if we leave, as you know, Andrew, 9 out of 10 economists, every bit of analysis that's been done by the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank, by the trade. Well, this is important.
I understand that, but it wasn't what I asked, was it?
But you're asking why do we want to remain
allied with people who have been prepared to impose mass unemployment among young people across the Eurozone?
Because we will have a weaker economy if we leave the European Union, if we take ourselves out of the single market, which gives us access to a market of 500 million people, which is really important for our economy. It will raise prices. The Governor of the Bank of England says it may lead to a recession. Now, we've just been through the most painful recession since the 1930s. Why would we want to even run the risk of going through that all over again? And that's why Jeremy and all of us are campaigning to remain in the EU, Andrew.
I understand that, which is why we're here to talk about it tonight. Let's come on to workers' rights. You mentioned that right at the top. Now, you've argued that the EU safeguards British workers' rights. Why are we incapable of doing that ourselves?
We're capable of doing both. One of the things about this debate, Andrew, is the Leave campaign suggests we can either have workers' rights in Britain or we can have them in Europe, or we can either trade with Europe or we can trade with the rest of the world. The truth is we can do both. And I'll tell you why we have them. Because if there weren't common rights, and the European Union protects workers' rights right across the EU, limits on working time, paid holiday, fair rights for women at work, protection for agency and temporary workers. The Leave campaigners describe those as red tape and bureaucracy and regulation.
Are you really saying, let's take paid holiday, which everybody counts on. Are you really saying that if we left the EU, we'd no longer be able to count on paid holiday? We've had paid holidays since 1938, which was a little bit before joining the European Union.
Well, we didn't have in this country, as you know, Andrew, until the Working Time Directive was passed, a statutory right to paid holiday for every worker in the United Kingdom, and we didn't have limits on working time. And I'll tell you why there is a risk. Priti Patel, who's one of the prominent Leave campaigners, has said she'd like to halve employment rights. Boris Johnson complained that the Prime Minister didn't get to grips with this problem, as he sees it, during the renegotiation. When Ian Duncan-Smith was on your programme and was asked, well, what is this bureaucracy you don't like? What did he refer to? Health and safety legislation. And my challenge to them is this. You know, I worked for the trade union movement for 20 years. I know how hard it was to win those rights. But what rights are they going to seek to take away? And it's about time they came clean to the British people.
All right,
but there's a second reason,
No,
Andrew.
I'm not going to let you go into the second,
no,
because
the
you need
second
to answer
why
the question
I'm
first.
answering the question.
No, I'm going to ask it. How much a paid holiday does the EU guarantee?
It guarantees less than currently applies in the UK because it is a flaw.
Right, and
it's
British
a flaw,
law,
and it prevents
but British law
a race to the
guarantees
bottom.
more paid holiday than EU law. So why would we lose that if we came out of the EU?
And that shows exactly why we can build on the basic rights that Europe provides.
But we had it before the EU.
We didn't have a statutory right to paid holiday. And, for example, it was a judgment of the European Court of Justice, Andrew, that won for women part-time workers the right to join pension schemes under a court case that was brought. But why do we have common rights across Europe? I'll tell you why. We have a single market with single rules. If there weren't common employment rights across Europe, it allows the bad employer to undercut the good and the worst employer to undercut the bad. If one European country said, right, no, we're going to weaken our workers' rights, and jobs started disappearing from Britain towards that country, what is the first thing that people would say? We need common rules throughout the European Union, and therefore those workers' rights protect workers right across all 28 member states.
But Mr. Benn, there is no prospect of any British government being elected that was going to abolish or reduce paid holidays or reduce maternity and paternity leave. That's not going to happen. It's just scaremongering.
It isn't scaremongering, because I'm taking the Leave campaigners on their own words.
They're not the government, and they're not being elected as a government. I mean, let's just take maternity leave. How much does the EU law guarantee on maternity leave?
We have better provision now because we chose to do that. But it's still
British
important.
law.
Exactly.
Why would that change if we left the EU?
It's not a competition between the two. No. But the Leave campaigners, significant figures, as you know, Andrew, in the Leave campaign have said one of their targets, if we leave the European Union, is to weaken workers' rights, which they describe as red tape and regulation. And there's lots of people who go to work who are protected by health and safety legislation. When Chris Grayling, who is a member of the government and a prominent Leave campaigner, says that he regards that as bureaucracy and regulation,
but Mr. Benn,
we're perfectly entitled to ask them.
They would have to be elected to do
indeed,
that.
The trouble is we have a Conservative government.
Which has not reduced paid holiday, which has not reduced maternity leave, hasn't reduced paternity leave. And if a Labour government was elected in 2020 outside the EU, you could strengthen these protections. You would have a mandate to do so.
Indeed, and we have a much better record of doing that. As
So
Labour
why do you
in government,
need the
the
EU?
Conservatives have ever done it for the reason I set out, that it provides protection right across the EU and it prevents a race to the bottom. And that helps workers in Britain as well as in other European
countries. But Norway,
countries.
Iceland, Switzerland, they're all outside the EU. They all score better than the UK, according to the Trade Union Confederation, when it comes to workers' rights. It's a matter of the democratic decision of a country.
My argument, Andrew, is you can have both. You can have a floor of basic rights right across Europe that protects workers, prevents a race to the bottom, and you can top that up by decisions that you take as a sovereign member state. You get the best of both worlds.
Let's move on to immigration, because people feel that a lot of workers' paying condition has been affected by uncontrolled immigration. If we remain in the EU, how would you control immigration?
Well, there are pressures. But the workers who come here from the European Union also contribute a great deal to our economy. In the last 15 years, they've paid in £20 billion more in tax.
I didn't ask you about the benefits. I asked you, would you control immigration or not?
I will just try and answer your question. One factor is the availability of work in the British economy, and there are jobs that need to be done, and those workers make an important contribution, and they pay tax that helps to pay for public services. Secondly, there are some changes that have been negotiated, which will mean if people are coming here to look for work and they haven't achieved that after 6 months, they can be asked to return.
Well, the key is to ask to leave. Can
but-
you give me any example of a European Union citizen job seeker who's had to leave because he couldn't find work or she couldn't find work after 6 months?
Well, during the renegotiation...
Can you give me an example?
A new agreement was reached, which will come into effect if we vote to remain. But the other thing I was going to say to you about controlling the impact of it is you have undercutting of wages, you have people who are not paying the minimum wage.
That's mainly for illegal immigrants. I'm talking about the 2.2 million EU migrants working in Britain. They're legal. They have national insurance numbers.
Of course they do.
And so I ask you again, since that number has gone up by 1 million since 2010, just from the EU alone, how would you control immigration if we remain in the EU?
The truth is, Andrew, is that there will continue to be immigration whether we remain in the EU or whether we leave. This week, what did the Leave campaign announce? That they would like to have an Australian-style point system. You know what the Australian-style point system has done in Australia. Yes. It has increased immigration.
But that's because the Australians want more immigration. That's been their policy. They want to control the quality, but they want more immigration. I'll ask you for a third time. How would you control immigration if we remain in the EU?
Part of the deal of being part of the European Union is free movement of workers.
So you wouldn't?
1.2 million British workers exercise those rights in other European countries. And we have a need for people to come in. After all, 1 in 5 of our care workers, Andrew, looking after our mums and dads and our grandparents, come from outside the United Kingdom. And as long as there are jobs available and we have an economy that attracts people and they pay tax, most people would say to me, if people are paying tax and they're working, then good luck to them, because they are contributing to our economy.
And that's a perfectly fair point of view for you and others to take. But let's be clear. In your mind, in Labour's mind, there is therefore no level of immigration that's unacceptable. There's no upper limit to it.
The upper limit will in the end be determined by the availability of jobs.
By the market.
By the availability of jobs in the economy.
By the market.
And unlike other countries where there are very high levels of unemployment, we have jobs that have been created in our economy, in part because we are in the single market. And if we lose access to that, we're not going to deal with immigration by trashing and undermining the economy, by raising prices, by running the risk of having another recession.
Net migration from the European Union was about 185,000 last year, net migration just from the EU. The Eurozone economies still have mass unemployment among their young. If net migration just from the EU alone was to rise to 250,000, that would be fine by you.
Well, we'll have to see what happens, and it depends.
Well, you said you'd leave it to the market.
It depends on the strength of the British economy, but it is part of the deal, and you have to weigh the argument that you're putting against the damage that would be done to the British economy if we leave the European Union and, as the Leave campaigners want, walk away from the single market, which is really important to attracting investment into Britain, to continuing to create jobs, and therefore to the incomes that families have.
There are 2.2 million EU migrants working legally. We don't know the illegal amount of immigrants, but legally working in Britain. It's doubled in 6 years. It's a big number. Are you really claiming that that's had no impact whatsoever on the pay and condition of British workers?
It has. The studies have shown, there's some argument amongst economists on this, but the studies have... Yes, there always is. That is true. Which is why getting 9 out of 10 of them to agree that leaving would be a bad idea shows the strength of the argument for Remain. But the studies have been done. The National Institute, for example, shows that there is a very small impact, but it's been far outweighed for those who've had a tough time in recent years by the effect of the global crash caused by the behaviour of the bankers.
Well, many people think that wages would go up if we left the EU and we cut immigration. People would have to pay more for their labour, even those on your own side. I want to show you what Stuart Rose, he's the leader of the Remain campaign, said when asked if wages would go up if free movement from the EU ended. And there he is. He says, if you're short of labour, the price of labour will go up. So yes. But then, of course, he added that's not necessarily a good thing. He's a businessman. But actually, it's clear it would. Wages would rise, particularly for the lower paid. And maybe I would suggest you would think that is a good thing.
Well, of course, I want to see people earning more money. That's why we brought in, as a Labour government, a national minimum wage, which, incidentally, Ian Duncan-Smith, who wants us to leave the EU, voted against. But we are not going to help people on low incomes and medium incomes and any other incomes, we're not going to help them by undermining our economy, Andrew,
but look at this,
by leaving the single market.
But look at the, I'm not arguing about the single market.
It may well be that
that's the price you have
for
to,
jobs, and it will be bad for wages.
That's the price you have to pay of uncontrolled immigration from the EU if you want access to the single market. But I'm just trying to get the impact on those who are already here. Of that 2.2 million, 1.25 million come from the poorer parts of the European Union, from the East, including Romanians and Bulgarians and so on. They're working in the UK. Are you really claiming that that influx has not made life tougher for those already in low-paid jobs in Britain, or for the 1.7 million Brits who've been looking for work and can't find it?
Well, it's had an impact on communities. When we were in government, we had a special fund, the Migration Impact Fund, that paid money to communities that were affected by high levels of migration.
I asked about the effect on wages.
I'll come to that. And one of the first things the Conservative government did was to get rid of that. What the studies show is there is a small impact, but that is far outweighed, one, by the impact of the global crash, and two, it would be far outweighed by the economic cost, running the risk of having another recession, of leaving the European Union, and all that that would mean for investment and for jobs in our economy.
What about housing and the impact immigration's had on that? The last Labour government and this Tory government, you both presided over huge increases in immigration, but you both failed to build enough new homes to accommodate this increase in our population. There's now a huge shortage. Young people can't afford to get on to the housing ladder. That's a consequence of uncontrolled immigration.
No, Andrew, it's a consequence of the failure to build enough homes, and that is entirely in our hands. It's nothing to do...
It was your hands for 13 years and you didn't build enough.
Well, we built a lot of homes during our time in government.
You didn't build anything like the number that was needed for the extra immigration.
We can have a discussion about house building. I'm very happy to do that. How are we going to do that? By communities taking responsibility for giving planning permission, for giving councils more power. It's one of the things that Jeremy Corbyn has argued for, to lift the borrowing cap on councils so they can build more council houses, because I have many constituents who can't get a home that they can afford. They're in the private rented sector, but that is down to us. And
it's nothing to do with immigration. We can have this huge influx of people. But
undermining the economy, Andrew, is not going to help us to build the homes that we need. And the housing shortage has nothing to do with it. It's down to our failure as a nation to build enough homes, and ruining the economy, which is what is at stake in this referendum. How is that going to help us to build the houses we need? It's not.
Let me look at some of the things. I mean, the last Labour government didn't build enough homes, as this Conservative one isn't. Let's look at what a future Labour government would do. If you stay in the EU, you would be unable to fulfil your promise to renationalise the railways, wouldn't you?
No, that's not true.
Would you like to tell us what Directive 4 says about this?
If you're talking about the fourth railway package, as I think it is described, it does not prevent member states from having a publicly owned and publicly run railway system. And if you want to look for evidence of that, Andrew, look at the railway systems in other European countries, and a lot of them are publicly run.
It doesn't stop the state owning the permanent way, owning the railways itself, but it makes it compulsory to have cross-border competition on the lines, and for other companies to bid against state or private companies for these same lines as well. It does not allow a return to British Rail. It involves competition, including the private sector. Even the Germans, two of their regions have had to open their state-owned lines up to private sector competition. You couldn't nationalise.
Well, I disagree with you, and I've looked carefully at... It's still in draft, it's still being negotiated, and I've spoken to our colleagues who are working on this in the European Parliament, but it does allow...
It's been approved by the Council of Ministers, it's been proposed... it's been approved by the Council of Ministers.
It does allow, but the European Parliament has still to finish the process, it does allow the direct awarding of contracts, which is what we seek to do if we win the election in 2020.
We spoke to the directive means that you have to allow the private sector to bid for lines. That's as clear as it is, and to open up national passenger markets to cross-border competition. That's what the directive says. And we spoke to the RMT today. They said there's no way that Labour could renationalise the railways if we are covered by the fourth directive on this, if we are still in the EU.
Well, I disagree with I disagree with their interpretation. And if we're elected in 2020, that is exactly what we are going to do.
You won't be able to change the fourth directive if you're elected in 2020. It will be European law. You would need the other 27 members of the EU to agree. They won't.
No, Andrew, it doesn't stop us doing what we want to do. OK?
Well, we shall see. Come on to free trade. It's another part where you may not get what you want. A key part of Remain's case is the advantage, it says, that we get when the European Union negotiates free trade deals to boost jobs, investment, trade, and so on with other countries or with regions. There's a huge one, as you know, currently being negotiated between the EU and the United States. The name it's given is TTIP. It's a transatlantic trade agreement that they're trying to reach. But I'd like you just to have a look at this, of what Mr. Corbyn said about it.
A few weeks ago, the French President, François Hollande, said that he would veto the deal as it stands, and to become law, any deal would have to be ratified by each member state. So today, we give this pledge. As it stands, we too would reject TTIP and veto it in government.
Do you agree with that?
Well, the TTIP is not finalised yet. There are two concerns. One is about protecting the National Health Service. And we need to be sure, the British public want to be sure, that there is a copper-bottomed guarantee that it will not affect a publicly run health service.
The EU says there is.
Well, we need to be absolutely sure
Rachel Reeves,
that
your Labour colleague,
all of that is covered. The second issue is what's called the investor-state dispute mechanism, where there is a disagreement about the way in which the scheme works. But in the end, we will have to agree it, and the best protection to ensure that we have a good trade deal, because the right kind of trade deal with the United States of America would be good for our economy. Right. The best way to ensure that is to stay within the European Union, because I wouldn't really want to see David Cameron negotiating a trade deal with the United States on our own if we were to leave the European Union.
Hold on, let's be clear about this. Remain has highlighted President Obama's threat. He said a couple of weeks back, if we left the EU, we'd be at the back of the queue when it comes to trade deals. But when it comes to the biggest ever trade deal, your leader, Mr. Corbyn, he's not even in the queue. He wants to quit the queue altogether. It wouldn't matter whether we were in or out of the EU on this trade deal. He doesn't want to do it.
Now, what he's said is he's expressed concern about two particular aspects of the deal, which are concerns that are shared by others. But if we get the right deal, then that would be good for the British economy, and we can support it, but we won't support the wrong deal.
He said he would veto it.
Indeed, we won't support.
And would you agree with that?
We won't. If it's not the right deal for Britain, then we shouldn't support it. But there's a long way to go, as you know, Andrew, in these negotiations. And what this, I think, brings us back to is the fundamental choice that we are facing in this referendum. You know, Andrew, today is D-Day. 72 years ago, British forces, our French allies, the Americans, set out from the south coast to defeat fascism, supported by all of those nations that had been occupied.
We haven't got much time.
I know, but this is a really important...
And I think we know what D-Day is.
I know, but the point I'm making is this, is for centuries Europe was mired in conflict. The leaders of Europe came together and said, we can do better than this. And they built the European Union, what it is today, which is the cooperation of free democracies, acted as a beacon to the Eastern European states as they escaped from the Soviet Empire. And my argument, our argument in this referendum, Andrew, is this. This is not a vote about the past. It's not a vote about the change that I've seen in my lifetime. It's about how we're going to ensure that our children and our grandchildren have the best chance of managing the change and the challenges they're going to see in their lives. And the truth is...
You've had enough.
Cooperation with our neighbours is the way to do it.
Right. I want to show you a quote from Mr. Corbyn, because he's not convinced that it would be all doom and gloom if we left. He's attacked George Osborne's prophecies of doom. This is what he had to say about the Chancellor's predictions of how bad it would be. He says, George Osborne claimed that the British economy would enter a year-long recession if we vote to leave. This is the same George Osborne who predicted his austerity policies would close the deficit by 2015. That's now scheduled for 2021. Is the Chancellor exaggerating, as Mr. Corbyn thinks, the risks to leave?
Well, Jeremy is absolutely right in pointing out that George Osborne's got a lot of things wrong.
I got that bit. Is he exaggerating the risks to leave?
I think the risk, and Jeremy himself, we've published a letter today signed by a very vast majority of Labour MPs pointing out that this would damage our economy, and the lead signatory is Jeremy Corbyn.
I understand that, but let me try again. Let me try with a third question. Is the Chancellor, as Mr Corbyn clearly indicates by that quote, he talked about prophecies of doom, about histrionics, exaggerations, is he exaggerating, the Chancellor, the risks of leaving?
The Treasury study that was published showed that there would be damage to our economy.
How big would the recession be?
Well, that depends.
Well, no, how big did the Treasury report say it would be?
Well, it talked about the loss of wealth generated by the nation and the impact that it would be. The Governor of the Bank of England has talked
I'm asking you about the Treasury report.
I'm talking about all
the Treasury.
of the studies that have been done.
How deep did the Treasury say the recession would be if we left the EU next year?
The person I'm quoting on the risk of recession is the Governor of the Bank of England. The Treasury warned of a damage to our national wealth and income. The Governor of the Bank of England has warned. Christine Lagarde of the IMF has said the outcomes could range from bad to very bad.
Treasury reports,
every single study that has been done has shown that it would be bad for our economy.
Central forecast was it would be the shallowest recession since 1956. And it may not even be right for that.
Well, are we actually sitting here discussing whether it would be a good idea to have a recession by leaving the European Union?
No, but I'm talking about the exaggeration. My whole question was on the exaggeration.
The point is there is a great risk. Because there are two facts in this referendum.
I'm only quoting
I know you are,
Corbyn,
Andrew, but there are two facts in this referendum. The fact of our membership, we know what it gives us, the benefits, jobs, investment, growth, security, influence in the world, peace for the continent of Europe, an astonishing achievement in the lifetime of many people in this country. And over here is the honest answer to most of the questions about what will happen if we leave. And the answer is, we don't know. And I don't think that the British people are going to take a risk on that uncertainty with the damage it would do to our economy when we know the benefits that being part of a partnership with our neighbours in Europe has given us. I want
one more question.
Okay?
If Leave wins this referendum, will your party, will Labour not bear some of the responsibility because it will have failed to inspire, motivate traditional Labour voters to vote Remain?
Well, I'm not contemplating that. We're campaigning hard every single day.
But you have a struggle.
To encourage people to vote Remain on the 23rd of June. And for me, the strongest and most inspiring argument of all is, if you're weighing centuries of conflict and death and cooperation, which we know is the future for the world,
all right.
That is the most powerful argument.
I'm going to have to stop you there, but you have made the point several times. So it's
Andrew, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Hilary, Benn. That's all for tonight, but I'll be back.